Can everybody hear me all right? I know some people there said they weren't able to hear. If you can't, can you flag up on the chat or something for Nick and Stephanie to see if they can do anything about it? If I don't see that coming up, I assume everyone can hear. Yeah. Okay, in that case, let me launch in. So as Nick said, my name's Douglas Bell. Please call me Doug. I'm a professor of language education with the University of Nottingham on their campus in China, where I am now. So the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. Talk today, as you can see, is called Strengthening the Nexus between English for Academic Purposes, EAP, and Academic Literacies, Ac Lits. And I'm going to propose that strengthening this nexus is a win-win, a big win-win for all concerned. And by the end of my talk today, I hope to have convinced you of that. So, to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to do, talk's going to be really in 7 parts. I mean, I'll start with a bit of personal history, tell you a bit about myself, how I got involved in EAP and why it's very close to my heart. I'll move from there to give you some definitions and some historical contexts for both EAP and Ac Lits. I'll then do a bit of a SWOT analysis. I'd like to do a contemporary SWOT analysis of EAP and Ac Lits, just to paint the picture of where they are at the moment. And then I'm going to say why I think the nexus between those two disciplines needs to be strengthened, and I'll provide some reasons for that. Following that, I'll talk through what I see as being the main current models for EAP and Ac Lits provision. And then I'll build on that why point and turn it into a how. So having said why we should have the nexus strengthened, I'll then say a bit about how I think that might happen, how might that be done. And I'll finish off with a few closing thoughts, comments, and maybe a couple of caveats as well. And I would hope at the end we'll have time for a bit of a discussion together. I don't know how long people have today. I'm basically free. It's a national holiday here. So I was setting aside an hour plus. But at the end, let's hopefully have a bit of an open discussion about all of these things I'll talk about today and share some thoughts. So, a bit of personal history. Many of you in the audience, I was looking at names flash up, many of you are friends and former colleagues, so you all know about me already, but for those of you that don't, let me share a bit about myself. Current date, I've been working in EAP now for about a quarter century, a bit more, probably about 26, 27 almost years now. So quite a long time. And this is why I feel I've got skin in the game, as it were. It's been part of my life now for a very long time. A quick sort of synopsis of that history. I started working in TESOL, in general English teaching, ELT, back in the 1980s. And like many people, I taught general English, I taught in schools, I taught in conversation schools, all of that. And then I migrated from general English teaching, as often happens, into ESP, and I was working in business English and corporate training and medical English and all of that. But then at the end of the 1990s, 1998, I moved into EAP teaching, and that was really in Turkey. I went out to work at Bilkent University in Turkey. Again, many of you in the audience, from the names that have come up, I know you're familiar with Bilkent. Some of you have also worked there, either at my time or earlier or later. But I went out to Turkey in 98 to work for Bilkent, principally as an EAP tutor, but also as a textbook writer. At that time, Bilkent were setting up their own in-house textbooks on EAP. They called it BASE, Bilkent Academic Studies in English. And myself and half a dozen others were involved in the production of BASE 4, which was the pre-faculty book, the higher-end book of EAP for their foundation students. So that was really when I first got my feet wet in EAP. I'd had probably at that point about 8 years experience of ESP, but this was the first time that I really got into EAP. And I guess in many ways, I haven't stopped being involved in EAP one way or another. So I was in Turkey for those 2 years that I've listed there. I then went back to the UK to do my master's, I did my master's at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, UCLan. I did a master's in teaching English for international business, building on the ESP interests that I had. But I ended up staying with UCLan. They employed me first as a lecturer, then a senior lecturer. And I stayed with them and was involved in their EAP provision and all sorts of things. At the same time, I was doing some work for Salford University in Manchester. I was working as a part-time EAP tutor, quite a lot of ESAP at that time. I was working with civil engineers and some medical students, all sorts. I then moved down to the far south. I went down to head up what was then a new English language centre at Plymouth, and I was head of the English language centre there for just over 3 years. I left Plymouth and went back up the country again to the Midlands, to Nottingham. I worked with Nottingham Trent, but I worked with the Nottingham Trent International College, which was then run by one of the private providers, which I'll say a bit more about today. It's actually run by Kaplan. So I worked with Kaplan for a while with Nottingham Trent. And then I went to the University of Aberdeen and headed up the language centre there. And that was English language, EAP, but also a host of modern foreign languages. And I ended up teaching quite a bit of Japanese there. I left Aberdeen in 2009 and came to where I am now, China. I came to the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, to be the director of what was then called, still is called CELI, the Centre for English Language Education. And CELI here does all of the work in the first year of usually of a 4-year undergraduate degree. We call it the preliminary year. And as you might imagine, all of that really is very focused EAP. So I was head of that from 2009 to 2015, and I was doing a lot of work with UON, University of Nottingham, and the other Nottingham campus in Malaysia, University of Nottingham Malaysia campus. That's what the UNMC acronym stands for. So that was 2009, 2015. And in that period, I started my PhD, more of which in a moment. And back then I was an associate professor. And I was pretty happy in my role here in China, but I felt I'd hit the glass ceiling. I wasn't going to get any higher than associate professor at that point. And a headhunter based in Australia came calling and said, have you thought about working down under? And this was with Charles Darwin University, way up in the north of Australia. I think there's some Australians in the audience today, in the Northern Territories. And I ended up going there. And the big attraction for me for going to Australia, well, there's several attractions. I mean, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. They said, look, if you come here, we'll make you full professor, which was, oh, great. Okay, fine. Sign me up. But the big thing that really attracted me to Australia and the particular role was that I was going to be head of a school called SAL, S-A-L-L, which was the School for Academic Language and Learning. And that for me was very, very attractive because in the Australian system, unlike the British system, which I'll say a bit more about as we go on, in the Australian system, Academic Literacies, EAP, by a different name if you like, goes out to all students. It's not just the international students. So True Blue, Australian students, good day mate, they also get EAP, not just the international students. And for me, that was revolutionary back in 2015. I thought, wow, what an opportunity to do something that I've felt for a long time should be happening in the UK, but isn't or wasn't at that time. So I'll be talking quite a bit about that today, this idea of who the audience should be for EAP or academic literacies. In Australia, it's everybody. Okay, so I was out in Australia for just shy of 3 years, 2015, 16, back end of 17. And then China kind of came calling again. The then provost here got in touch and said, could we entice you to come back? There's a professor role here about to be advertised, head of the School of Education. Might you be interested? And to be honest, at first I wasn't particularly interested. I was quite happy in Australia, but I made the fatal error of telling my wife, who is Chinese. And as soon as I told her, hey, would you like to go back to China? She said, yeah, definitely. Let's go home. Let's go back to China. So this is essentially why I came back to UNNC. Blame my wife. So I came back here in 2017, at that time to be head of what was the School of Education. We've since become a School of Education and English, and I stepped down from the headship. But I've been here since 2017, and I've been still involved one way or another in EAP. I no longer teach EAP in the sense of going into a classroom to teach, academic writing or referencing, but I run a module on EAP on our MA-TESOL program. I work still with colleagues from Sealy on all sorts of things. So one way or another, I'm still involved with EAP. I never seem to get free of EAP. So that's a snapshot, if you like, of my skin in the game, why I'm particularly interested in EAP, and if you like, my sustained involvement. A couple of things to highlight, perhaps, as part of that. When I was head in Plymouth back in 2004, my team and I at that time developed what was the first in the country at the time, a PGCT, so a postgraduate certificate in teaching EAP, because I'd felt for many, many years that there was a gap in the qualifications and preparation market, and that most people I was dealing with who worked in EAP had come into the field with a background in TESOL or applied linguistics. They hadn't, if you like, been specifically trained in what to do in EAP, and I thought that was a problem. And my team and I set up this PGCT in 2004. I think as a result of doing that, I got invited to take part in a bar leap project at that time, which in time became the competency framework, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with in the audience, published in 2006. We mapped out a team, half a dozen of us. We were all working at different UK universities. We mapped out what we thought was a competency framework for EAP practitioners. Other milestones in the personal history. I said I'd started my PhD while I was in China on my first stint. That was back in 2012. And I really wanted to do my PhD on something to do with EAP because I'd had so much involvement with it. And ultimately, my PhD looked at this. You can see the title there, Practitioners, Pedagogies and Professionalism in English for Academic Purposes. And I called it a contested field because it seemed to me that EAP has been a very contested field. It's still a contested field. And in my doctorate, I really wanted to focus more on the who and the how. Something I was arguing throughout the doctorate was that there's been an awful lot of attention in EAP on the what. If we go into the pages of JEEP, you can find reams of articles that deal with language analysis, that deal with genre, and all of that's fine. But there hadn't been, at that point anyway, much of an emphasis on the who. Who gets involved in EAP? How do they become professionals in EAP? How do they professionalize? And also on the who and the how. What does teaching EAP involve? So I really wanted to look more at those things. So that was the PhD. Finished the PhD in 2016. That was when I basically became a full professor in Australia, just before I came back to China. And then just a couple of years ago, 2023, I was thinking, you know what, it might be interesting to go back and have a look at some of those findings that I had in my PhD and revisit them, see if anything had changed. I mean, one of the things I did in my PhD was to interview, as Nick mentioned, interview lots of well-known household names, if you like, in EAP, all of the usual suspects from the 1960s right up to that year, the 2000s. So it was people like Henry Widdowson, John Swales, Ken Hyland, all of these people I'd interviewed. And I thought in 2023, it might be interesting to go back and interview some of these people again and ask them similar questions and see, has anything changed? Have the things that were identified as being problematic, have they been solved or have they worsened? Let's go back and have another look. So I was doing that in 2023 as a research project, and it ultimately morphed into this book. There we go, shameless plug of a new book. So English for Academic Purposes, Perspectives on the Past, Present and Future. And a bit more recently, I was invited to write an article for a special issue of the International Journal of TESOL Studies. It's just come out. It's online, but the hard copy has just come out. And it's a special issue which is looking at the future of TESOL. where is our industry, the broader industry, where's it going? What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats? And I was invited to contribute a chapter there on, or an article there on the future of EAP. So as you can see, bright or gloomy, some speculations on the future of EAP. And I'll be cross-referencing some of the stuff in my article in the talk today. Okay, that's the sort of personal interest, personal history, and why I think I've got some skin in the game. If I move now then to provide a few definitions and historical contexts, I mean, a lot of what I did in my doctorate, in my book, to some extent in this recent article, is to look at the historical development of EAP. I'm very interested, maybe I'm a closet historian, I don't know. I'm interested in how things develop, particularly how academic fields develop. So let's have a look at EAP. As I'm sure everybody knows, it's a very young field. It hasn't been around that long. It emerged really in the 1960s, early 70s, so within my lifetime, which always gives me pause for thought. And if we look at that historical trajectory, it was originally conceived as a sort of knee-jerk response to meeting the needs of international students in the UK. So if you go back and look at all of that documentation, there's some in the archives at Warwick University and some on the Barleap website, and you can still talk to some of these individuals, the ones that are still alive. You can see that trajectory. So before 1962, there wasn't very much going on at all, very piecemeal, just bits and bobs. And then 1962 seems to have been a milestone year because Vera Adamson was appointed at Birmingham and tasked with providing support for overseas students. So this was formalizing what we now know as EAP. And it kind of went from there. I mean, the 1970s, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the name Bob Jordan, an old friend, sadly no longer with us, working at Manchester University, or Ron Mackay at Newcastle University. They were doing lots of work. And other universities as well, British universities, were starting to sort of jump on that bandwagon. And that came to a head with the establishment of CELMUS, which of course is the forerunner of what we now have Barleap. So CELMUS, established in 1972. And you can see it's all in the title there, isn't it? Special English language materials for overseas university students. So it was very much a reaction to international students coming into the UK. That's really what kicked it all off. Now, if you look back at that early history of EAP, I think it's pretty clear that there was an early emphasis on language proficiency and on testing proficiency. As evidence for that, I would point to two particular tests that were developed, or batteries of tests. There were tests developed by Alan Davis at Birmingham University in 1964, the EPTB, and then at Leeds University by Brian Heaton, 1971, the so-called Leeds proficiency tests, the sort of forerunners of IELTS in a way, but these were testing language proficiency. I would also say that if you look back at the history of EAP, back in the early days anyway, it was originally quite narrow in its focus. So I'll take a quote here from Bob Jordan, who was writing his seminal book, I'm sure you're all familiar with, in 1997, but he was then quoting from paperwork, almost 2 decades earlier than that, the British Council Ethic in 75. EAP is concerned with communication skills in English required for study purposes. Okay, very straightforward, uncomplicated. EAP equals preparing people for study. Very straightforward in the early days. And I think this idea of linking EAP with study, it was becoming synonymous with the idea of study skills and study competencies. I mean, if you look at the publications, for example, between the 80s and the early 90s, definitely the emphasis was very squarely on study skills. So again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these books. You might still be using these books, very venerable texts there. I mean, there's Wallace's Study Skills in English, or Tony Lynch, Study Listening, still alive and well. I'm not sure what edition it's in now. Or Liz Hamp-Lyons and Ben Heasley's book, Study Writing. So there's very much an emphasis. EAP at this time was basically synonymous with study skills. However, in more recent decades, I would argue it's moved away from that a bit. EAP has been steadily widening its remit and its scope. And let me just evidence that claim with a few more quotes from different people. So that first, quote about EAP by Bob Jordan and the British Council back in the 70s, compare that with jumping forward to, say, Flowerdew and Peacock's work, 2001, you can see I put it in red. It's expanded. It's not just studying now. It's studying, it's also conducting research, and it's also teaching. So it's widened. It's not just about study. If you look at Ken Hyland and Liz Hamp-Lyon's work from a year later, they also bring in wide dimensions. They're talking now about cognitive demands, social demands of specific academic disciplines. So we're already starting to see this specificity that, of course, Ken Hyland is very well known for. And as Hyland said in 2006, it's a broad term, EAP, covering all areas of academic community practice. So it's been broadening, it's been getting broader and broader. And I would say that where we are now with EAP is that arguably it's become a recognized discipline in its own right. It used to be an offshoot of ESP. It was the relation, it was the sister or the brother or the cousin, however you want to frame it, of ESP. But over time, it's grown up. It's become an adult. It's become a recognized discipline in its own right. So to evidence that, again, I'll draw on some work from Ken Hyland. If you look at this quote here, as he points out, it's much more theoretically grounded, it's research informed, it's got all the trappings of a full-fledged educational practice. Now, I've said arguably in the bullet point there because not everybody agrees that EAP is a discipline. I would argue that it is, but not everybody would. It's still contested. And an article I wrote a few years ago, I was using some work by a guy called Krishnan, who had an interesting article about, well, what makes a discipline a discipline? And certainly based on Krishnan's criteria, EAP ticks those boxes, and I talk about this in the book. But not everybody would agree that EAP is a discipline, so it's still a bit contested there. But I think, for my money, it is a discipline, and it's widened its scope considerably compared to how it was back in the 1960s and early 70s. So a few more points to make about EAP. It's still primarily a tertiary educational endeavour. When we say EAP, mostly we're thinking about university level higher education. That said, it has been making, and arguably still is making, inroads into secondary education. If you wanted to have a look at some of those articles, George Bunch and others, Johns, Brisk, and a more recent one, there was a special edition of JEEP a few years ago looking at EAP in secondary schools. And this is still going on. I mean, I have a teenage daughter. She's going to a secondary school here in China, and I was surprised some months ago to look at her homework, what she was doing. She was learning to reference. I mean, she was learning APA referencing style, and she was saying, "Oh, Daddy, is this an insight? Is this an in-text citation?" And I was thinking, hell's bells, you're 15 and you're doing this. I couldn't do this when I was 20. So EAP is definitely going down. It's moving out of the university and dropping down into the secondary space. Be interesting to see how that continues to pan out. A big point I want to make in the talk today, because it kind of underpins the reason why I think the Nexus needs to be strengthened, is that EAP is still principally being offered to students for whom English is not the first language. To qualify for EAP, de facto, you've got to be a non-native speaker or a non-mother tongue speaker of English. That's how it typically works, certainly in the UK. And I would say, as part of that, EAP is still broadly delivered in two camps. We're either talking about pre-sessional type of delivery, and when I mean pre-sessional, it can take all sorts of forms. It could be literally a summer pre-sessional, a short intensive program, or it could be a year-long foundation course or a bridging course. It's still pre-sessional in the sense that it's before students get into their disciplines. So it's either pre-sessional usually or in-sessional, where it's going on in conjunction with the subjects that students are studying. And again, there's all sorts of models, as everyone knows, for how that operates. It may be credit rated, it may be non-credit rated, it may be clinics, it may be workshops. But this division into either pre-sessional provision or in-sessional provision still pretty much accounts for EAP, I would say. It's still primarily taught by those with a background in TESOL or applied linguistics. I mean, the 100-odd of you in the room today, if I asked you all what your background is, I would bet you a pint that most of you will have a qualification in TESOL. A few of you might not. You might have migrated into EAP from somewhere else, but I would say most people will have started in TESOL or applied linguistics and they've moved into EAP on that trajectory. And as part of that, and this is also a point I'll come back to a bit later, EAP is still a discipline that's dominated by master's qualifications. If you want to get qualified to work in EAP, you look at any of the job ads, they all ask for a master's. They might ask for a Delta, Celta Delta, Trinity Dip, but almost all of them will ask for a master's. Very few will ask for a PhD, and this is something I'll come on to later. So it's still dominated by masters. A bit of a darker point to make, which again I'm sure we're all familiar with, EAP, for better or for worse, does tend to be seen as a service, which means it doesn't typically get the same academic status or indeed the working terms and conditions as other disciplines, other subjects in the academy. So if you teach EAP, you're usually not on the same sort of contract as somebody who's teaching geography or business or psychology or whatever else. It's usually a service. And just to evidence that, I mean, few things I could point to there. One of the guys, it was John Flowerdew actually, Professor Flowerdew, I interviewed for my doctorate back in 2014. This is something that Professor Flowerdew said when I talked about status. He said, oh, well, in the disciplines, they seem to think that you're just the grammar guy. You're just the fixer. You're the person who comes along and fixes up people's grammar. And we see it even among ourselves, the way we refer to ourselves has a smack of this thing about poor status. I mean, Alex Ding and Ian Bruce's seminal work, The EAP Practitioner. Look at the wording of that book, operating on the edge of academia. We're not quite there, we're on the edge. Or indeed my own writing recently. I did an article a few years ago accounting for the troubled status of English language teachers, and I was trying to explain why I think that is. Or a paper given by Sarah Taylor. I'm not sure if Sarah's in the audience today, at the last BARLEAP, one of the last BARLEAP conferences, stigmatized identities. So I think that there's little doubt we all agree that EAP doesn't get the same status as other disciplines. And it's interesting to think about why that might be and how we could change that, I think. Okay, that was a snapshot of a bit of a gallop through, but that was a snapshot of EAP's history and context, historical development and context. Let me now switch over to have a look at Ac Lits, because we're talking about two arguably different disciplines today. So let's have a look at Ac Lits. Well, Academic Literacies, first thing to say, it's younger than EAP. I started by saying a moment ago that EAP was a young field, and it is, but Academic Literacies is even younger. Ac Lits emerged in the 1990s, so we might say 3 decades after EAP, and it came from a very different background. Whereas EAP came out of ESP and applied linguistics and genre, Ac Lits came out of new literacy studies. Very different beast. Ac Lits is principally concerned with approaches to academic reading and writing, particularly writing. Doesn't focus in its traditional format on speaking and listening. It's all about reading and writing, with the emphasis on writing. And in contrast to EAP's take on academic writing, or the traditional EAP approach to it, Ac Lits views reading and writing as social practices, which are going to vary with the context, the culture, and the genre. And there's a seminal, it's always cited as the sort of birth of Ac Lits, a seminal article by Lee and Street, Mary Lee and Brian Street, back from the 1990s. And they explain in that article, they go to lengths to explain that Ac Lits is trying to encapsulate approaches rather than replace them. So in that seminal article, they saw Ac Lits as being one of three approaches, if you like, that you've got the study skills approach, which typically was EAP. You've got the academic socialization approach, which is, you know, getting people into the culture of higher education, socializing them. And then they said we've got the Ac Lits approach. So they saw it as these three things, but all overlapping and closely related. I think it's fair to say that in its original incarnation, so wind back 20 years, Ac Lits was trying very hard to move away from this idea of a deficit model. It didn't want to make it seem that, you know, there was anything remedial about teaching people about academic writing. Instead, they wanted to reposition it as something that was multifaceted and very complex and reliant on contexts and culture. So moving away from this deficit model in its original configuration. I might say more about that in a wee while. And in the original configuration of Ac Lits, it was originally predicated on this idea that students should be encouraged to make sense themselves of their own approaches. They shouldn't necessarily just accept prior assumptions or make any prior assumptions. They should make sense for themselves. And they should recognize that meanings are, in fact, highly contested. There isn't any one truth about things. And I guess as part of that, Ac Lits has tried to put student writing within this wider framework, which looks at institutional practices, epistemologies, the way that knowledge is formed, power, who has the power and how is that power wielded, and of course, identities. So you can see influence of critical theory going on here. And in fact, you can see influences here of critical EAP. If any of you, I'm sure all of you, are familiar with the work of Sarah Benesch, there's quite an overlap there with a lot of the things that Sarah Benesch was talking about with critical EAP. So Ac Lits was building on some of those established traditions like critical discourse analysis, SFL, systemic functional linguistics, a lot of stuff out of Australia, the so-called Sydney School of genre based on SFL. This has played into the Ac Lits space and cultural anthropology. So all of these things have been influences on the Ac Lits, on the way Ac Lits has developed. Now, in my talk today, I'm saying that there should be a strengthening of the nexus between EAP on the one hand and Ac Lits on the other. But I need to make an important point about this. When I'm saying that the nexus needs to be strengthened, I'm not actually referring to the traditional definition of Ac Lits, because I feel myself that the traditional conceptualization of Ac Lits is too narrow. The way it was originally formed by Lee and Street, for my taste, it's a bit too narrow. So I think we need an updated conceptualization of what we mean by Ac Lits for 2025. And this is a preliminary stab at kind of defining what we mean by Ac Lits. I'm sure that you'll be able to add other things to this. I don't think I've captured everything. But for me, Ac Lits means this: what a student, any student, emphasis on any, what any student needs to know and be able to do in order to be deemed successful across a range of academic contexts, encompassing the domains of reading, writing, speaking, listening. So not just writing, which was the traditional Ac Lits, or not just reading and writing, because that's not enough. We need to bring in speaking and listening there as well. We also need to bring in IT skills. We also need to bring in research skills. We need to bring in social interaction skills. We need to bring in critical thinking. And as of the last couple of years, I would argue we now need to bring in Gen AI. And I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. But for me, this is what I mean when I personally talk about Ac Lits. So it's not quite the same as the original model, if you like, of Ac Lits. I feel that we need a new conceptualization. And this is what I mean when I talk about strengthening a nexus. So let me do a bit of a SWOT analysis. I said in my opening introduction that I would provide a SWOT analysis of where I see things at the moment with EAP/Ac Lits. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, all good business school stuff. If we look at the strengths, first of all, I mean, seems to me a pretty obvious strength of EAP and/or Ac Lits is that it's still booming. There's still an ongoing need, particularly in countries like where I am now that have been embracing EMI, English as a medium of instruction. So as long as EMI is alive and well and growing and booming, there's a knock-on need there for EAP, and that's got to be a strength. The second strength, as I put there, is that I think if we look at TESOL as a field, as a broad field, English language teaching, TESOL, I would say that EAP still represents the top end of that field in terms of pay, conditions. You know, if you give someone the choice, do you want to work in Bob's English School or do you want to work in a university? I guess most people would prefer the university for, you know, reasons of pay and prestige and all of that. So I would see these as strengths. However, there are some weaknesses. As I've already mentioned, big weakness perhaps is that EAP is perceived as a service industry rather than as an academic discipline in its own right. Arguably, that's a weakness. I would say a bigger weakness is that there's a lack of established entry points to becoming an EAP teacher. You know, I teach a module on EAP as part of our master's program here, and every year, you know, I've got at the moment 70 odd students coming through. Quite a few of them would like to work in EAP. And as I explained to them, the pathways into EAP are not very clearly marked yet, even though we've had the field since the 1960s. Lots of different ways into EAP. There isn't one recognized sort of route. And I still see that myself as a weakness. Within EAP as an industry, another weakness is that there's very limited progression within EAP and quite poor job stability, and it's getting poorer and poorer, as all of us who follow the Barley pages and connect on LinkedIn or what have you, we all know, particularly in the UK. We're living in very precarious times. Lots of colleagues have been signing so many petitions over the last few weeks and months, people losing their jobs, departments being closed down. We're living in a very dark age at the moment, I think, for EAP. This is a huge weakness. So job precarity, lack of stability, and limited progression. I mean, I look at the EAP situation here where I am in China. The progression is very limited. You get hired as an EAP tutor, and basically that's it. You remain an EAP tutor. If you're very, very lucky, you might get promoted to be a senior tutor, but most people don't. Most people, because of the competition, they'll be an EAP tutor from day one until the day they leave. So there's no progression in the same way that there is with, for example, a career in academia, where you come in as a teaching fellow and then you go from teaching fellow to assistant professor, then to associate professor. And if you're very, very lucky, you make the lofty heights of full professor. EAP usually doesn't get treated that way. So that's got to be a major weakness, I think. In terms of opportunities, I mentioned already EMI. So I see this as a huge opportunity actually for EAP. The fact that EMI is enjoying a boom worldwide, not just in China, that's a big opportunity for EAP professionals. There's also an opportunity regarding the continued growth of English as the language for academic publishing. Rightly or wrongly, if you're an academic and you want to publish your research, you pretty much have to do it in English, as we all know. But that's an opportunity for EAP/Ac Lits professionals. And I'll, again, come back to this a little later. The opportunity there. I think there's an opportunity within the disciplines, within EAP/Ac Lits. There's an opportunity for more teacher education, more teacher training. I don't like the word training because it suggests sort of parroting behaviors, but teacher education, training, development. I think there's a need for more of that. As I said, way back, my team and I in Plymouth set up that PGC TEEP. I prophesied at the time that a few places would copy us, and they did. A few more PGC TEEPs came out. In due course, a few MAs in EAP came out, but most of them have withered and died. I think Leeds still have their MA in fairly recent in EAP. But there's not a massive focus on educating people, training people how to become EAP teachers. It still tends to be dominated by MA TESOLs and MA Applied Linguistics. So I think there's a need for more focused teacher ed in EAP. There's also a big need, any of you that are familiar with my writing, this is something I bang on about quite a lot in various articles. I think there's a need for more practitioner research. You know, whenever I open the pages of JEEP, I do a lot of reviewing for JEEP and for ESPJ and other journals. I sit on their editorial boards, but I still see a dearth of practitioner material. Lots of people write about something very academic or very esoteric in some cases, or very linguistic. There doesn't seem to have been that much interest in writing about what I see as the nuts and bolts of what 99% of EA people do, which is teaching. So there needs to be more on that, I believe. Emergence of Gen AI, I see as a big opportunity for EAP Ac Lits people. I'll say more about why that is in a moment. I also see it as a threat, and you'll see. But anyway, opportunity or threat, Gen AI is here, and we have to deal with it. In terms of other threats to the industry or industries, there's a lack of formalized benchmarks and credentials. As I said, there's a lack of very clear qualifications and pathways. That's quite a threat, I think, to the professional status. And of course, in more recent years, we've got this phenomenon of private providers. Huge expansion of that. I wrote about it in my doctorate, and I've written about it in my book, and I've mentioned it in several articles going back to probably about 2012 or 2016. A very real problem now in the UK. I'll say a bit about this later, but I mean, just to be clear with everybody, because some people in the audience might be working for a private provider, I've got no issue with individual teachers working for private providers. As I mentioned, I used to work for Kaplan myself. I was working for a private provider. My issue, for the record, with the private provider thing is simply that it's pulling the status of EAP pulling it down. It's taking EAP out of the academy and reducing its status. That's my beef with the private providers. I've got no issue with individual teachers or people having to find a job. But I do have concerns about what the private provider expansion has done, is still doing to EAP's academic status. The third threat that I've mentioned there are what I see as changing demographics around international student mobility, and I'm going to talk about that, I think, on the next slide. We're currently witnessing some pretty big changes in this area, and that's got to be a major threat as far as EAP is concerned. So let's lead in from there to say why this nexus needs to be strengthened. My talk today was arguing that there does need to be a strengthening of the nexus. Well, why? Well, the first one is this point about the changing demographics in international student recruitment. I would say that as long as EAP is seen as something which is only offered to international students, that's a massive threat and a massive problem. It's going to restrict its development. It's going to limit its shelf life. I mean, in many contexts, if international student numbers go down, then clearly EAP is going down too. Now, I was banging on about this, oh goodness, almost 10 years ago. When I was doing my doctorate, this was something I was arguing in articles and presentations and bar leap talks, and it does appear to be coming true. I mean, I went back to talk to some of those people that I interviewed for my doctorate when I was preparing the book. And one of the individuals I spoke to, it's an anonymized respondent here, so I won't say who this is, but it's a very high-level, well-known professor in the field. Just look at what this professor said when I was talking about this. The unhealthy reliance of British universities on overseas students, especially on Chinese students. If the overseas students' revenue was withdrawn, lots of universities would go to the wall in Britain. It's as simple as that. And that's actually what we're seeing happening now, isn't it? We look at all the closures that are currently sweeping the UK. EAP departments either being closed altogether or significantly trimmed down. It's all to do with the lack of international students, the lack of revenue, because of changes to do with visas, because of changes to do with not being allowed to bring your dependents with you, because of the growth of EMI in many ways. Lots of the Chinese students now I work with, study with, teach, they don't need to go to the UK. They can get their qualifications right here in China. So all of this is having a pretty big knock-on effect for EAP, certainly in the UK or in English-speaking countries. And as this professor says at the end there, what would EAP do if Chinese students stopped coming to Britain? So as I've said in the point above there, if the international student numbers go down, EAP is going to go down too. So that has to change. We've got to get around that. We can't have EAP only reliant on international students. If we continue to do that, we're sowing the seeds of our own disaster, in my view. Another reason why this nexus needs to be strengthened, a much more recent reason, I would say, because of the advancing capabilities of Gen AI. We're all familiar with ChatGPT and DeepSeek and all the derivatives that have been in the news the last couple of years. And I would say that, you know, it's a game changer. It's an absolute massive game changer. It's not going to go away. It's just going to continue to develop. And as it develops and becomes more sophisticated, it means that universities also have to develop and become more sophisticated, not in the sense of policing it and trying to stop it and block it, which is where many universities were a couple of years ago when ChatGPT first came out, but in better understanding how to use it, how to get the most out of it. And I think if we don't do that in universities, we're actually doing our graduates a disservice. We're not preparing them for the workplace, because from what I can see, once they get into the workplace, they're going to have to use AI. So universities need to get with the program and start showing students how to use AI effectively. Couple of quotes there to evidence that. There's a good friend of mine working out in Australia. I'm not sure if he's in the audience today with the time difference. Daniel Anson. Daniel wrote a very good paper. It's in my bibliography at the end if you want to have a look at it. He works as an Ac Lits, a learning development professional in Australia. And he wrote this article back in 2024, looking at how Ac Lits, learning development, language, academic learning and language, how that might be interfacing with ChatGPT. So for me, a very seminal article there from Daniel. And as I'm shamelessly quoting from my own work there, my latest article, it seems to me that we should be embracing this as EAP, Ac Lits professionals. We need to be looking at how Gen AI can be legitimately used, fully harnessed in the university. At the very, very least, it means a rewriting of what we would typically teach students about plagiarism. You know, we can't just continue to talk about plagiarism in the way we used to. We've now got to upgrade it to include ethics around using Gen AI. And one of my PhD students currently out there in the audience, he's looking at this very question. And I think it's going to be a big question for the future, the ethical use of Gen AI in academia, and particularly how it relates to academic writing. So I do think this is another reason why that nexus needs to be strengthened. Now, the private providers. As I mentioned before, there's been this expansion of the private providers. I mean, to me, as I said before, I've no issue with individual teachers working with Into, Study Group, Kaplan, Navitas, whatever, but I do have an issue with what it's doing to the status of EAP. And I think that if EAP and Ac Lits, as I've defined it in my definition for 2025, if that can become stronger, then I think we still might have a chance to reclaim some of this diminishing status of EAP in the academy, and it's going to help to offset even further outsourcing and privatization. So I'm going to quote there from Alex and B. Bond and Ian Bruce, what they were saying about the privatization. I mean, they're very forthright, saying it's a blight and it's an existential threat. I think that if EAP and academic literacies can join forces more strongly, it's going to help to offset more of this outsourcing and privatization. It's a chance to reclaim some of our expertise and status. Something else I mentioned today already is EMI and the continued growth and expansion of EMI. Definitely, as EMI continues to expand, it means that we're going to need a better understanding of what constitutes EAP and academic lits. That's also going to increase alongside it. So again, a couple of quotes from fairly recent texts to evidence my claim there. One there from an article by Kamashak, Shan and Rose, Heath Rose, Oxford. There's a shift. EMI is signaling a shift from studying English as a foreign language to using English for the study of academic content, so EAP. And of course, we all know it requires a lot more than just simply continuing as usual and doing all the teaching English. There's a lot more behind it. So EAP and Ac Lits are going to play a central role here. And they're also going to play a role at the secondary levels, as I mentioned. You know, EAP, that kind of work is dropping down from universities into secondary schools and maybe even elementary schools, as Helen Bash-Gurkman and her co-author there point out. In South Korea, it's quite well established, but it's also emerging in high schools. So this is another reason why we need a strengthening of the Nexus. And I guess the main reason why I think there needs to be the strengthening to wrap all of that together, the big reason why I think things need to be strengthened is because at the current state of play, the prevailing modus operandi are very disparate and they're very fragmented or relatively fragmented. As I've already said today, they're targeting different audiences. EAP typically is only being offered to international students or students badged as international. Ac Lits, by contrast, gets offered to domestic students, typically. So different audiences. And certainly in my experience over the last quarter century of involvement in both of these, one thing I see is an awful lot of duplication of institutional resources. When I was working at one of my former institutions, I won't say where, I was head of the English Language Centre there, and ostensibly the place where everybody who wanted EAP or Ac Lits should have been coming or going to. But with a bit of scratching, I found out that there was all sorts of stuff going on all over the institute. There were, you know, some people had employed their own sort of Ac Lits EAP type people. There were people doing it in the library. You know, it was all over the place. So an awful lot of duplication of resource. I mentioned, I think, already today, this idea of a deficit model. EAP traditionally has been, I think, ideologically based on a remedial or deficit model. We're fixers. Students are deficient in language and academic skills. It's our job to fix them. And even though the original incarnation of Ac Lits was very much against this deficit model, I would say from my experience of working in it, somewhat paradoxically, it's actually still perpetuating that, because very often the students that are offered Ac Lits are still seen as somehow being deficit in a deficit, somehow remedial. Very often it's older students coming back to university after some time out who get offered the Ac Lits provision. So it's still playing into this deficit space, which I think is just wrong. Very importantly, a reason why we need to strengthen the Nexus is because EAP departments and Ac Lit centres, they tend to sit outside mainstream academic frameworks in terms of job titles and terms and conditions and all of that. They're usually outside of that, which all of those things makes them highly vulnerable. And obviously it's in red for a reason. And it's what we're witnessing now in the UK with all of these closures. These centres, these provisions are very, very vulnerable, and they tend to be the first to get picked off. When money isn't coming into the university for whatever reason, these are the first units that come under the hammer. Yeah, so all of this makes them very vulnerable. And we need to think about ways to get around that, which I'll move on to in later slides. So let me quickly go through what I see as being the current models for EAP Ac Lits provision. I won't cover absolutely every single model, but what I would see as maybe the top three. Let me just talk through those. I'm calling them modus operandi A, B, C. Modus operandi A is where I would say EAP and Ac Lits are mostly kept separate from one another. Never the twain shall meet. And I would say that's probably the most common operational model that's still prevailing in my experience. So it's a case where you've got EAP being offered either by an in-house dedicated English language centre, like Sealy, like we've got here, or by a team within a particular academic school or department. So you might sit within the School of Education or the School of Languages or wherever, or, God forbid, by a completely outsourced private provider, and all of that work just gets shunted off to study group, Navitas, Kaplan, or whoever. That's the EAP. Academic literacy support, by contrast, tends to be offered by dedicated units elsewhere in the institution. So it might be in student services, it might be in the library, could be in all sorts of places. I mentioned student services in the library as the most typical in my experience. And there'll be advisors who are in there providing Ac Lits support. But here are the negatives with the current modus operandi as I see it. The first one, I've already said, is that EAP is only offered to international students. Why? But it is. And academic literacy support is in theory open to everyone, but the participation is usually voluntary, which means very often in my experience that the people who most need it are the ones who don't actually avail themselves of it. And the provision itself is usually in the form of workshops or drop-in clinics. And to go back to what I said about the deficit model, just look at the language. I mean, clinics. You go to a clinic to see a doctor when something's wrong with you. So that even the use of language here is sort of promulgating this idea of a deficit, I think. And the underlying ideology is still based on that. It's still remedial. It's still resolving a deficit. So that's what I'm calling modus operandi A. Modus operandi B, a bit more sophisticated. This is where we've got the EAP and Ac Lits combined under an embedded model. And I'm saying here it's still relatively rare. If I look at the 100 and whatever it is, 160 odd universities in the UK, not all of them are doing that, but a few are. A few are starting to do this. So it's been gaining ground, this idea of embedding. Under that model, we've got EAP and Ac Lits support offered by one or more discipline-specific staff who are embedded within particular academic schools and faculties. So somebody might be working in mechanical engineering or computer science or whatever, and it's their job, they're embedded, their job to provide discipline-specific EAP/Ac Lits support. And I've mentioned quite a few writers there who've written extensively on this. Ursula Wingate from King's, big name in this area. She writes a lot about this. Neil Murray might be in the audience today, I don't know, from Warwick. Also, lots of writing on this, and you can check those citations out in my bibliography at the end. But this idea of embedding the support rather than having a central or standalone unit. But although the embedding is certainly a step forward compared to modus operandi A, to my mind, it's still not quite doing what it should, because the provision may or may not be credit rated. There still may be some restrictions from what I can see talking to people on who can and can't access that support. Neil Murray talked about two types of embedding, soft embedding and hard embedding. In the soft embedding model, where the EAP professional or Ac Lits professional is working in conjunction with a subject specialist, their input might actually be quite limited. It might just be, you know, they get to come into a lecture and they get half a dozen slides in that 2 or 3 hour session. So it might be very limited, the embedding. In cases of what's been called hard embedding, the training on the EAP or Ac Lits might actually end up being covered entirely by content lecturers rather than EAP or Ac Lits specialists. Now, some of those authors I've mentioned there, they're actively arguing for this. They're saying that this work is better covered by content specialists. Now, I myself would disagree with that. I'm not so sure about that, because certainly many of the content specialists I talk to, they don't particularly want to do that work. They don't see themselves as being prepared for that work. So many people I talk to, they say, well, yes, pick on computer scientist. I'm a computer scientist. That's my thing. I'm a professor of computer science. I teach computer science. Yes, I publish and write in computer science, but I don't really want to be teaching my students how to write in computer science. I don't see that as my job. I see that as an academic literary specialist, a learning developer's job. So the jury's out on this, whether or not it should be the subject specialist to teach this. More pragmatically, I guess, another reason why I'm not myself in favour of that is that I think it's doing us out of a job, frankly. If we're saying, well, all of that should be handled by subject specialists, well, we're chopping out a lot of people's jobs there. So I wouldn't myself see modus operandi B as the best one. So what is the best one? Well, for my money, what we want is what I'm calling modus operandi C, which is where EAP and Ac Lits are combined, and most importantly, their instruction is made compulsory. Now, this does happen, but it's still very, very rare. But I personally believe this is what we should be striving for. For me, this would be the gold standard. And it's whereby we have EAP/academic literacy support being provided by a fully fledged, fully tasked centre or school, and that's their remit. They're dedicated to doing that. And it's linked very closely with enhancing student experience. Most universities I come into contact with these days have got vice provosts, vice principals who are in charge of student experience. Suddenly ESE has become a buzzword. And it seems to me that we should be linking onto that much more forcefully than we are at the moment. If we're serious about improving the student experience, the experience of all students, not just the international students, then we need to be providing this kind of instruction, I believe. Under that kind of model, under modus operandi C, completing modules on EAP or Ac Lits would be a core component of the university experience. And there's a very good article by Julia, I think of her name, Julia Hathaway. I don't know her personally. It'd be nice if she's in the audience today. She could tell us about this herself. But a very good article from 2015 talking about one of these core courses that everybody at the university where she was working was required to do. It was a requirement, and it was an EAP/Ac Lits module. And it was compulsory, and everyone had to do it. And this kind of reflects the experience I had in Australia. What I said at the beginning about one of those drivers for going out to work for Charles Darwin was because the school had this model. And we had units in my school at the time. We called them the common units. We had 3 or 4 common units that all students enrolled at Charles Darwin U had to complete at different stages in their student journey. So there was one common unit, that they had to do in the first year. And that was really the sort of more Ac Litsy type stuff. And then there was one they had to do a bit later in their journey. And there was one they had to do closely before graduating. That was looking more at employability and graduate outcomes and things like that. But all of that was getting delivered by EAP/Ac Lit specialists working in very close collaboration with subject specialists. So not embedded in the sense that modus operandi B was suggesting, but obviously working in very close collaboration, not divorced from the subject specialists, working together. But for me, this is what I think is the gold standard that we should be striving for. So how? One thing to say, this is the thing we should be doing. How we're going to do that? Well, it seems to me what I'm calling modus operandi C, this offers some very clear advantages to those working in EAP and or academic literacies. I mean, first advantage is it makes what they do central to the successful operation of the university. So rather than them being on the edge as Alex and Ian call it, this actually brings them straight into the core. So makes them central. By being central, it gives practitioners the opportunity to trade on several of those forms of symbolic capital that others trade on in the academy. And I spent a lot of time in my doctorate talking about capital. I was using Bourdieu's ideas: capital, social capital, academic capital, symbolic capital. But there's no doubt about it that universities operate on different forms of capital. And typically, EAP teachers, Ac Lits teachers, by dint of their contracts, by dint of their job roles, they're precluded from trading on those forms of capital very often. So this model would, to my mind, give them the opportunity to start doing that. Concomitantly, as part of that, it would provide them with a much better, clearer, structured framework for their own academic career advancement. If we could get EAP/Ac Lits people onto the normal university framework where you start at teaching fellow and go up to professor, if we could get people into that framework, it's got to be better for their careers. So you know, no longer the case that you're an EAP tutor and that's all you are. You've got the chance to actually progress in your career, which of course is going to give people more job security. It's going to give them more continuity. And it's going to give them a much clearer professional identity. We won't have some of those problems that we've currently got around EAP people feeling that they're second-class citizens. So that's the benefits for EAP, Ac Lits people. But what about the institutions? After all, they're the ones that we have to sell this to. And it seems to me it's not a very difficult sell. I mean, in the grander scheme of things, if institutions offer EAP, Ac Lits to everybody, it's actually going to help with things like student success and student retention. And, you know, I said already today, student success has become a buzzword. Well, let's walk the talk. Let's really look at what student success means. It means that it's going to become a quantifiable metric for enhancing the student experience. It means that EAP/Ac Lits, it means that we've got a place where we can centralize our knowledge of Gen AI. I said earlier today that this is an opportunity for EAP, Ac Lits people. I know my current institution, we're all scrambling at the moment to decide how to cope with Gen AI and what we should do with Gen AI. If we have a central repository, if we say, yeah, we've got the, whatever you call it, the center, the school, the college, whatever name we give it, that's the place where all of the Ac Lits and EAP and pedagogy around Gen AI is stored. We've got that place for expertise in those areas to be centrally developed. Going back to what I said earlier, it avoids duplication of services, so it's more cost effective. And the other thing to say is that if we have a specialized unit, school, college, whatever, that is dedicated to the development of academic literacy, it means that those people can also support academic staff in their publications. So high end, Ken Highland once called it high advanced, I think advanced EAP. So working with other academic colleagues to help them with their academic writings, not just the students. That's another string that can be added to the bow. It seems to me that those of us who are leading EAP or Ac Lits units, we need to be actively lobbying the senior management of our respective institutions to make these arguments. And this is happening. I'm personally lobbying on some of these things at the moment in my own institution. I know several other universities here in China are doing similar things. They're moving away from this idea of a sort of isolated EAP entity and moving more towards an academic literacy type of gig. And I think this is long overdue. And I think right now the timing is actually right for this to happen because we're in crisis. As I said, all the jobs going in the UK, got to start moving on this now. However, there's a but coming here. This is maybe going to be the contentious bit for some people today. However, if we want to have what I've called modus operandi C, if we want to have that accepted and we want it to get full credibility, it means that from the outset, everybody who's involved in that has to meet and then actively trade on these forms of capital. Okay, we've got to get that right from the beginning and grow from there. So the forms of capital, it means playing the game in terms of qualifications. So the people who are working in this modus operandi C are going to have to be PhD holders. I don't see any way around that in terms of getting the full capital and the full buy-in. So in terms of qualifications, also in terms of research outputs, those professionals who work in this area are going to need to be research active. They're going to need to be publishing and doing scholarly stuff in that area. They're going to need to be working very closely interdisciplinary, as we all are, you know. And finally, they're going to need to be bringing in income, whether it's from grants that are going to look at this area, or increasing numbers of students, whatever. But these are the four big ones, I think, in terms of capital, valued capital in higher education. And I think we now have an opportunity, if modus operandi C type centres, schools, colleges, institutions, whatever, are being set up within a university, it's an opportunity now to get this right, because I think EAP historically got this wrong. And we've had a, if you like, we caught a cold 50 years ago, and we've continued to suffer from that cold, I would argue. It's very, very hard to turn that particular ship round now. So this is it's an opportunity. I see this as a chance to put EAP Ac Lits back on the map. So I'm coming closely to the end of my presentation now. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. A few closing thoughts and comments. Share a few quotes, I think, from, I mentioned her before, Ursula Wingate, some very, very good writing in her works there. As she points out, it's very unlikely that we can find a one-size-fits-all for writing instruction. Whatever pedagogy we use, it's going to draw on a range of approaches and methods, and we've got to decide what's the most suitable for our context. And a quote there from Neil Murray, which is just saying the things that I've been banging on about today, that every student stands to benefit. So it's not just the international students, it's every student will benefit from getting help with academic literacies. You know, it should be offered to everybody. It should be an integral part of student learning. I couldn't agree with Neil Murray more. Now, I've been talking a lot about things that should happen. Maybe let me say something that I think definitely should not happen. So what those of us involved in EAP Ac Lits should definitely not be doing, in my humble opinion, is this. We definitely shouldn't be burying our heads in the sand and just hoping that things are going to get better all by themselves, or just hoping that, you know, the spectre of Gen AI is going to go away and it won't affect us. We mustn't do that. We mustn't bury our heads in the sand. These problems are here. We've got to deal with them. Okay. So maybe in closing, if I shamelessly self-quote from my most recent article, I would say the worst thing we could do would be to ignore these changes and to continue doing things in the same way that we've done up to now. I strongly believe that if we do that, particularly because of what's going on with Gen AI, there's a very real chance of EAP as we know it, as we knew it, becoming obsolete. So we've got to move with the changes here. And I think, as I say at the very end, this means management, people who are involved in the management and the delivery of EAP, definitely need to keep their eyes on the ball, and it's a very fast-moving ball at this moment. So that's my closing thought comment. I've got lots of references here in the bibliography. People can have a look at in their own time. If anybody wants a copy of my slides, by the way, feel free to email me. I have no problem. I'll share them with you. Just ping me an email. I'll show you my email in a moment. But that first one there is the article by the friend I mentioned, Daniel Anson, well worth a look. And there's lots of other ones there. There's a few of my own things. Other ones I would point out, this one by Ursula Wingate and Angela Hakim, 2024. This is about the embedding approach. Very, very worth looking at. Similarly, that article I mentioned by Hathaway, 2015. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with that already. So lots of different sources there. Neil Murray's writing. If you want to go back for historical purposes, you can go back and look at the original Lee and Street, applied back to 1998, the seminal article that arguably kicked it all off. And then loads of stuff, as I've mentioned today, by Ursula Wingate. Very, very worth looking at her work. There's a whole body of work there that she's done on Ac Lits and EAP. And I think we're saying broadly the same things. I don't fully agree with that we should be moving to this embedding model for the reasons that I gave earlier. I certainly don't agree that it should be done by the subject specialists, because I think we're doing ourselves out of a job if we argue that. But I do agree with probably about 98% of the things that she's written about. So thanks very much for participating, folks. It's quite a long, gabbly chat. I hope it's made sense to you. Let's finish there. And if anyone has any questions or wants to crucify me, now's your opportunity. So thanks very much.
Right, thank you so much again. I apologise to everyone again, just profusely, and especially to Professor Bell, just for the delay in the start. So I do apologise that. I'm just going to stop recording now. Doug, if that's okay, hang on, let me just stop recording. Doug, if that's okay,